So we have yet another edition of Europeans realizing just how strange the United States of America actually is. So without further ado, let's get into this first video. Things I find weird as a European living in America, part 2.
Things I find weird as a European living in America. Part 2. Why do we need a downstairs fridge? What is the purpose of a front
Wait, hold on.
downstairs fridge?
I don't know where he's living in America, but that is not something that I had growing up. Now, mind you, I grew up in a fairly well-off environment. I don't come from wealth per se, but I do come from a middle to bordering on upper middle class environment. We did not have a second fridge. We had one refrigerator, and that was more than enough for the four of us. This might be more common in places that have a basement. We didn't have a basement in Texas because something about the way the soil is or something like that. You just can't have basements there. But having multiple fridges is definitely a sign of wealth as far as I'm concerned, especially if you're talking about two large refrigerators where you're not talking about a mini fridge, you're talking about two full-sized refrigerators. This isn't full-sized by American standards, but I'm looking at the fridge that we have in our apartment here in Vietnam, and this is pretty much the same size as our primary fridge. And it's more than enough to handle all of our food. So maybe it's because Americans just eat more.
What is the purpose of a front lawn?
The purpose of a front lawn is to create a lot of additional hassle for pretty much no reason. I know some people, they really like the idea of having their own space, having a front lawn or whatever. This lawn doesn't look like it's being taken care of that well, though. I'm not gonna lie to you, but I don't know. I always thought that that just seems like a hassle. It's a big part of why I'm not particularly enthusiastic about purchasing a full house, but because we're going to get a house in Europe and not the USA, this probably won't be much of an issue, because what I noticed is that a lot of the houses in Europe, at least in the Netherlands where we were at, didn't have these large grass lawns like this, which is great because I don't ever plan on purchasing a lawnmower in my whole entire life. Say what you want, I don't care. You come cut my grass for me.
Why do we need a faucet on top of a stove?
Okay, the more of this video I watched, the more I realized he's not having a conventional American experience. I have never seen this before. I don't know if this is something new that they're just now starting to implement, but we most certainly did not have this. I've been in many new construction homes throughout the US, seen a lot of new construction homes on the internet. I have never seen this before. I'm talking about, I've seen videos of $40 million penthouses in New York City and $100 million mansions in Southern California. I've never seen this before. I have never seen this. Let me know if you've seen this anywhere, because this must be something unique to this one house.
Kind of like it though. Do we really need a soaking tub?
Okay, yeah, the people who he's living with, or I don't know if this is his house or what the situation is, someone has money. Someone has money in this equation, because normal people don't have these standalone tubs like this, especially sitting on those rocks like that.
I used it once in 5 years because you made me. Getting old sucks. I need to get out.
Yeah, no, this is not a traditional American experience. Even the shower, I can tell all of the stuff that we're seeing on the inside of the house here, it all looks like they basically remodeled. So this is all new. And the inside of the house most certainly does not match the outside of the house, because this looks like a house probably from, I would say, the 70s or 80s. I'm not an architecture guru or anything like that, but based on the homes I've seen on Zillow, which is basically the home buying website, a lot of the homes from that era looked kind of like this. So probably 70s or 80s. So we're talking, what, 40, almost 50 years old? Yeah, this is definitely an old house that they renovated. But this is not the normal American experience. Perhaps this video will be a better representation of the normal American experience. Let's find out together.
I'm a Brit living in America, and these are the biggest culture shocks that I've experienced. So I do live in a HOA neighbourhood as well, which means that everyone has to keep their grass at a certain height and all really neat. So everyone in this entire neighbourhood have got really nicely kept front gardens, which I find in England is not something that most people really do.
Okay, so hold on.
I find in England...
When I look at the background right here, she's not having a typical American experience either. This is not normal. Okay, this is not how the average American is living. I know people see the GDP numbers and stuff like that. This is not how most people are living. Again, I grew up in an environment where we never really wanted for anything. I did not grow up like this right here. This is a different level. So she is loaded. Or whoever is paying for this house, if not her, they're loaded. And it's in Florida on top of that. But she mentioned the HOA. I think I briefly brought up the HOA in one of my previous videos, but let me elaborate really quickly on what that is. So HOA stands for Homeowners Association. Basically, in a lot of the newer neighborhoods in the US, the HOA exists for, honestly, I can't think of a logical reason why they exist. I guess it's to keep the property values in the neighborhood high, but you pay a fee. You pay a monthly HOA fee, and in return, they force you to keep your grass a certain way and to park your cars a certain way and to abide by a certain standard of, and I don't even want to say a standard because it's not so much a standard, abide by a certain rule book that they arbitrarily determine. So in other words, you want to paint your house from this color to light blue, the HOA won't allow it. They won't allow it because supposedly it'll lower the property values of all the other homes around it, which makes no sense, by the way. It makes absolutely no sense. People talk about the land of the free. That is not my American dream. I'll say that right now. That is not something that I really aspire to personally. I just don't aspire to that. And to my knowledge, that's not really much of a thing in the EU. Correct me if I'm wrong on that, but I've never heard of that being much of a thing in the EU. When I was in the Netherlands, most of the houses were not detached. So obviously when you have a townhouse, which is what Americans call it, I don't know what you'd call it in the Netherlands, but basically where you have what look like individual homes, but they're all attached in one building. You can't really customize your individual house. At least in most cases, I don't think you can. But in Dutch neighborhoods where you have standalone houses, no two houses are going to look the exact same. You have variety in terms of the architecture, in terms of the stylistic elements, in terms of if you have a 2-car garage, a 1-car garage, or no garage. That's one of the most fascinating things that I personally noticed. Whereas in the US, neighborhoods tend to be a lot more, we call it cookie cutter.
And it's not something that most people really do.
Yeah, the reason why they are keeping up the lawns like this is because they don't want to get fined. Now, in some cases, they usually will have an actual landscaping team to handle that, which really any neighborhood that has an HOA should do that. If they're going to pay money for the HOA, then the HOA should take that money and hire a landscaping team to keep the lawns the way that they want them to look. But I don't know. For me personally, I don't like when people try to control how I operate. So imagine working your whole life to buy a house and then the HOA is fining you because your lawn isn't up to their standards or because you parked your car in the wrong spot. You parked it in front of the house instead of in the driveway. Things like that. In fact, in my neighborhood, my dad ran into a lot of friction with the HOA because he wanted to build a shed in the backyard and they didn't want him to do that. Makes no sense.
American flags are very common out here. You'll see them on people's houses or on their mailboxes as well. Now this is something...
So with that right there, I actually think that's one of the things that's slightly overblown in my experience, because when I went back to the US to visit earlier this year, I was expecting to see flags on every other person's lawn. That wasn't really the case. It's more so that in Europe, you just don't see a lot of flags overall. So you see some flags in the US, or maybe I just kind of tuned it out. That could be a possibility as well. But I didn't see a whole lot of flags. Being here in Vietnam, you see a lot of flags. All right, you can't see that building. You can probably see the lights from the building, but basically it's another high-rise building. And on, I would say, 20% of the balconies on that building, you'll see a Vietnamese flag hanging from the balcony. So you have a lot more state pride here than I ever saw in the US. But one thing I will say is that flags are more common in the US than in any European country I've been to. This especially seems to freak out people from Germany for obvious reasons.
Thing that you do not see in England, people just do not put up the British flags. Out here in America, the most common house that you'll find is a detached house. Now, this is something that we are not very used to in England. I would say mostly they are townhouses or semi-detached houses. So another thing that you don't really see in...
What is a semi-detached house? I know what a townhouse is, so I guess they call it the same thing, but I don't know what a semi-detached house is. I guess that would be like a duplex, maybe? There are some duplexes in the US, but in this day and age, you don't really see a whole lot of them. And something else that you might have noticed between not only this video, but this video right here, we look at the front lawn. It's my understanding that the reason why so many houses in the US have front lawns is because the urban planning rules actually require that to be the case. So a lot of times, houses are required to have garage parking. They're required to be, I think it's offset from the curb by a certain amount, and that amount will differ depending on the jurisdiction. But I don't believe that's much of a thing in Europe, because in Europe, a lot of times you'll have the houses literally right on the sidewalk where they don't even have a front porch. You just step out and you're on the sidewalk immediately. Definitely a very, very big difference.
England are fire hydrants. Now, fire hydrants are out here, out in the open, right there. You'll often see them throughout the neighbourhood as well, and that's something that I don't think I ever really saw back in the UK.
Wait, now that I think about it, is that also the case in the Netherlands? That's one of those things I never even considered, so I wasn't on the lookout for it. But there are definitely a lot of fire hydrants in the US. Is that also the case in the Netherlands or in other European countries? Let me know in the comments if that's the case, because if they don't have them just out and about, where would they be? Where are they located?
Another one was the size of the roads and the cars out here in America. America is known for everything to be bigger, and those are definitely bigger. It took a bit of getting used to, but we've been here 6 weeks now, so I feel like we're quite comfortable being on the big roads. And if palm trees count...
So that's actually the first thing that not only I noticed when returning to the US from the Netherlands, but it was also the first thing my girlfriend noticed upon arriving in the US. I remember I picked her up from the airport at DFW, and we're driving on the highway. I think I passed through the toll and we're merging onto the highway. And the look on her face, mind you, if you've ever been to DFW airport, you know there's pretty much nothing there. There's nothing around the airport. You have some just obscure buildings, maybe warehouses or something like that, but there's not really a whole lot of sightseeing to do around DFW airport, really in DFW in general for that matter, but different discussion for a different day. But she was looking around like we were in Times Square, New York or something. And I was like, "Are you good?" And she was like, "Why is everything so big here?" Didn't really understand that until I went to the Netherlands and saw that everything is indeed oversized in the US. Now, mind you, our experiences comparing Texas to the Netherlands, we basically saw the most extreme ends of the spectrum. Because I know in maybe some of the newer parts of, I don't know, Germany, for example, the roads might be a little bit larger than in the Netherlands because it's a larger country, so they can afford to have slightly larger roads. Whereas in, let's say, Boston, Massachusetts, the roads aren't going to be as large as in Texas. But we definitely got a very good glimpse of the difference in the road sizes. And when we talk about the vehicle sizes, I mean, I call it the fridge theory. I've mentioned this in a few of my other videos, but basically, when people have a fridge, or in some cases, I guess, you have multiple fridges, like this guy right here, but when people have a fridge, a lot of times they'll fill the fridge up to the extent that they think they need a bigger fridge. So they go out and get a bigger fridge, And then a couple years later, that fridge is full as well. And they keep running into that problem until they realize that they are the problem. I think that philosophy applies in multiple arenas of life, including but not limited to the roads. People see these big roads and think, what's the point of driving a Honda Fit? Or what's another small car? A Ford Fiesta on a road like this, a Toyota Yaris, when I can fit probably a Ford F-350 with these big wheels that come up to here. And that's what people opt for. Now, of course, there are other factors that play into why people choose larger cars, and that's probably something that warrants its own separate video. But I'm saying this to say that if they made the roads smaller in the US, I suspect that the sales of Ford F-150s and Cadillac Escalades, Chevy Tahoes, cars that you just don't really see in Europe, would probably decline drastically.
As a cultural difference, then that is definitely something that Florida has an abundance of, and I love it. Out here in America, everyone has post boxes, mailboxes that are outside of their house, so there's no letterboxes. The mail comes out here, which actually works great. As we have dogs, it means that the dogs bark so much less.
So one thing that I noticed is that I don't think, and it could be different depending on where you live specifically in Europe or the US, but in the US, you have the mailman driving the mail truck. So basically the mail truck is this little boxy looking car. I'll put a picture on the screen right now. And the wheel is on the opposite side because he basically drives up to the mailboxes and puts the mail in. In Europe, from what I saw, that is not a thing. In the Netherlands, in the parts of the Netherlands that I was in, they walk up to your door and put the mail in the mail slot. And the reason why this is the case is because the homes are so much closer together that it's more practical to just walk.
Postman does not come to your door. Another one is so many houses have these basketball hoops, and this, honestly, it is just like the movies.
So I think growing up in the US, I can only speak to my experience, but I always knew at least one person who had a goal like this. In fact, one of my neighbors had a goal like this, and we being the neighborhood kids, we'd all go to that person's house and we play basketball pretty much until the sun went down, and then we'd play some more. So that is a core memory that I have. That's one thing that I did kind of miss, which it makes sense because in Europe, basketball is just not as popular, at least for now. I think basketball is on the rise in Europe, especially in places like the Netherlands and France. You have Eastern European countries that are doing really well, producing players like Nikola Jokic and Luka Doncic, but I can go on and on about that. But this is something I never saw, literally ever, in Europe. People having their own individual goals. And I think a big part of this is actually their community-oriented mindset. You see, in the US, I feel like what people tend to do is they try to get the biggest yard that they possibly can and make the yard sort of a sanctuary for their kids. So they might have a basketball goal, maybe a pool, a trampoline, all of these other things. Not saying that people in Europe don't have those things, but it's more so that in Europe, from what I saw, people tended to rely more on the public parks, and there tended to be a lot more public parks, which in my opinion fosters a great sense of community amongst the children and even amongst the parents at times.